Get ready for a story of suburban warfare, rural rebellion, and one very determined farmer. Before we dive into the shocking details, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss any of our wild stories. Bart Higgins, a man whose weathered face and calloused hands told the story of 60 years spent wrestling a living from the earth, found a crisp, white envelope tacked to his barn door. The barn itself, built by his grandfather, stood as a testament to generations of Higgins who had farmed this land, its weathered wood groaning softly in the breeze. The envelope, however, was starkly modern, bearing the embossed seal of the Oakhaven Meadows Homeowners Association. A shiver of unease ran down Bart's spine. He'd intentionally kept his distance from the sprawling, manicured development that had sprung up around his 150-acre farm, Higgins Harvest, over the last decade. He preferred the company of his cows, chickens, and the occasional grumpy goat to the chattering of suburbanites. He ripped open the envelope, his eyes scanning the dense legalese with a growing sense of disbelief and then simmering rage. The official notice, couched in polite but firm language, declared that his beloved farm, the land his family had owned and cultivated for over a century, was now deemed community land under a newly adopted bylaw, Bylaw 47B, subsection C, paragraph 12 to be precise. The bylaw, passed with what the notice described as overwhelming community support, required his voluntary cooperation in adhering to a strict set of aesthetic guidelines and land usage restrictions. This included but was not limited to limitations on livestock numbers, restrictions on the types of crops he could grow, and most gallingly the mandated removal of unsightly farm equipment from view of the road. It was an outright assault on his way of life. The voluntary aspect was a thinly veiled threat. Non-compliance, the notice warned, would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. Bart crumpled the paper in his fist, the sound like a dry leaf crushed underfoot. The scent of hay, manure, and freshly turned earth, usually a comforting aroma, now felt tainted by the acrid smell of bureaucratic overreach. He muttered a string of colorful curses, the kind only a seasoned farmer could conjure, directed at city slickers, lawyers, and anyone who dared to tell him how to run his farm. He'd always known this day might come. He'd seen the way the Oakhaven Meadows residents looked at his farm, not with appreciation for its bounty, but with disdain for its rustic charm. They wanted a picture-perfect landscape, not a working farm. His first instinct was to ignore it, to pretend the notice was just a bad dream, a misplaced advertisement. But the reality of the situation and the potential consequences quickly sunk in. He couldn't afford to ignore this. He had to fight. He stomped towards his trusty rust-covered Ford pickup, the engine sputtering to life like an old friend agreeing with his indignation. He dialed the HOA office number listed on the notice, his fingers fumbling on the keypad. The cheerful, pre-recorded message that greeted him, "Welcome to Oakhaven Meadows where community blossoms," nearly sent him into a fit of apoplectic rage. He slammed the phone down. He would do the talking face-to-face. The drive to the Oakhaven Meadows HOA office took 30 minutes of simmering resentment and growing determination. The office itself was a monument to suburban sterility, all glass and polished steel surrounded by meticulously landscaped flower beds. It looked more like a high-end spa than the headquarters of a governing body. He parked his mud-splattered truck next to a gleaming, pristine SUV, a silent act of defiance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of artificial flowers and the hushed whispers of receptionists. He marched towards the front desk, the crumpled notice clutched in his hand like a weapon. "I need to see the president," he announced, his voice booming through the tranquil space. The receptionist, a young woman named Sarah with wide, nervous eyes, stammered something about appointments and procedures. Bart cut her off. "Tell Deborah Sterling that Bart Higgins is here, and he's not leaving until he gets some answers." After a tense few minutes, Sarah ushered him into a spacious conference room. Deborah Sterling, the HOA president, was everything Bart expected and despised. Impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly coiffed, her smile radiating an air of condescending superiority. She was flanked by a nervous-looking secretary, Kevin, who seemed to shrink under Bart's gaze, and a smug, sharply dressed lawyer, Mr. Abernathy, whose presence confirmed Bart's worst suspicions. The meeting, if it could even be called that, was a disaster from the start. Deborah, maintaining her infuriatingly calm demeanor, explained that Bylaw 47B was perfectly legal and in the best interests of the entire community. She spoke of property values, aesthetic harmony, and the need for unified development. She even used the word progress, as if bulldozing a century-old farm was a sign of advancement. Bart countered with a passionate defense of his land, his heritage, and his way of life. He pointed out that his farm predated Oakhaven Meadows by over 100 years, that his family had been working the land long before their community was even a gleam in some developer's eye. He spoke of the importance of local food production, the absurdity of restricting livestock on a farm, and the sheer arrogance of dictating how he should manage his own property. The argument escalated quickly. Mr. Abernathy, with a practiced air of legal intimidation, threatened Bart with lawsuits, injunctions, and hefty fines. Bart, his face flushed with anger, responded with a threat of his own, though he hadn't quite formulated it yet. He just knew he wouldn't back down. He slammed his fist on the polished conference table, hard enough to make Kevin jump and scatter Deborah's perfectly arranged pens across the surface. The confrontation ended in a stalemate. Bart, seething with frustration, stormed out of the office, leaving Deborah fuming, Kevin visibly shaken, and Mr. Abernathy already drafting a cease and desist letter. As Bart climbed back into his truck, the engine sputtering in sympathy, he looked back at the gleaming HOA building, a symbol of everything he despised. He knew this was just the beginning. He drove back to his farm, the setting sun casting long shadows across his fields. He stared out at his cows grazing peacefully, his chickens scratching in the dirt, his goats, well-being goats. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan as stubborn and resilient as the ancient oak tree that stood sentinel at the edge of his property. A plan that would send a clear message to the Oakhaven Meadows HOA, a message they wouldn't soon forget. It involved electricity and a very definitive boundary. Bart Higgins wasn't a man to back down from a fight, especially when it came to his land. The confrontation with Deborah Sterling and her legal lackey Abernathy had only fueled his resolve. He spent the next few days in a whirlwind of activity, fueled by black coffee and a simmering sense of righteous indignation. His plan, born from a mixture of desperation and defiance, was audacious, bordering on reckless, but he was convinced it was his only option. He was going to electrify his fences. Not just a mild shock either. He was aiming for a jolt that would make anyone think twice about crossing his property line. He started by researching electric fence systems, poring over manuals and online forums, his old laptop perched precariously on a stack of hay bales in his barn. He learned about jowls, pulsars, ground rods, and the various types of wire that could deliver the most persuasive shock. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, not seriously, but he wanted to make a statement. He wanted to create a barrier, both physical and psychological, that would keep the Oakhaven Meadows busybodies at bay. He ordered the supplies online, using a pseudonym and a P.O. box to avoid raising any suspicions. When the massive boxes arrived, delivered by a bewildered-looking UPS driver, Bart felt a surge of grim satisfaction. He spent days working from dawn till dusk installing the fence. He dug post holes, strung wire, and meticulously connected the Energizer, a powerful unit designed for large livestock. He tested the fence repeatedly, using a voltage tester and on one occasion his own gloved hand. The resulting jolt made him yelp, but it also brought a grim smile to his face. He didn't just electrify the perimeter facing Oakhaven Meadows. He fortified his entire property line, creating a complete electric barrier. He even added extra strands of wire higher than legally required, just to make his point absolutely clear. He put up numerous large, brightly colored warning signs: danger, high voltage, electric fence. He wanted to be absolutely certain nobody could claim they weren't warned. The first reaction came, unsurprisingly, from a dog walker. Mrs. Henderson, a retired schoolteacher and a notorious gossip from Oakhaven Meadows, was strolling along the edge of Bart's property with her fluffy white poodle, Fifi. Fifi, sniffing enthusiastically at the base of one of the fence posts, yelped and leaped back, its perfectly coiffed fur standing on end. Mrs. Henderson, initially concerned for her precious pet, quickly turned her attention to the fence itself, her eyes widening in horror as she read the warning sign. Within hours, the Oakhaven Meadows online forum was buzzing with outrage. Posts ranged from indignant complaints about the unsightly fence to hysterical accusations that Bart was endangering children and pets. Deborah Sterling, predictably, led the charge, posting a lengthy rant about Bart's reckless disregard for community standards and his flagrant violation of numerous bylaws. She called for an emergency HOA meeting and vowed to take swift and decisive action. The local newspaper, the Oakhaven Gazette, picked up the story. A young, ambitious reporter named Jessica Miller sensed a juicy conflict and drove out to Bart's farm to interview him. Bart, initially wary, agreed to talk, seeing an opportunity to get his side of the story out. He explained his reasons for electrifying the fence, emphasizing that it was a direct response to the HOA's attempt to seize control of his land. He portrayed himself as a David fighting against a Goliath, a lone farmer defending his livelihood against a powerful, overreaching bureaucracy. Jessica's article, published the following day, presented a surprisingly balanced view of the situation. While it included quotes from outraged Oakhaven Meadows residents, it also gave Bart ample space to explain his perspective. The article sparked a wider debate in the community, with some residents surprisingly siding with Bart, expressing sympathy for his plight and questioning the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Meanwhile, Mr. Abernathy, Deborah's lawyer, was busy drafting another letter, this one threatening immediate legal action if Bart didn't remove the electrified fence. Bart, however, had anticipated this. He'd consulted with a lawyer of his own, a grizzled old country lawyer named Jedediah Jed Hawkins, who specialized in property disputes and had a reputation for fighting tooth and nail for his clients. Jed assured Bart that while the HOA might have some grounds for complaint, they were on shaky legal footing. He advised Bart to stand his ground and to document everything. The emergency HOA meeting was a chaotic affair. Deborah Sterling, red-faced and furious, demanded that Bart be fined the maximum amount allowed under the bylaws. She even suggested exploring the possibility of obtaining a court order to have the fence removed. However, the tide seemed to be turning at least slightly. Several residents, emboldened by the newspaper article and Jed's legal opinion, voiced their concerns about the HOA's actions. They questioned whether the community land bylaw was even legal, and they worried about the precedent it set. The meeting ended without a clear resolution, leaving Deborah frustrated and Bart cautiously optimistic. The electric fence for now remained. He had won a small but significant victory. Bart Higgins knew that the electric fence was just a temporary reprieve. Deborah Sterling and the Oakhaven Meadows HOA weren't going to give up easily. He needed to escalate his defense, to make them realize that trying to control his farm was more trouble than it was worth. He needed a distraction, a diversion, something that would shift the focus away from the fence and onto something messier. His livestock provided the perfect opportunity. The plan, hatched over a late-night brainstorming session with Jed Hawkins, was audacious and, frankly, a little bit crazy. It involved a series of carefully orchestrated, accidental livestock escapes. The goal wasn't to cause any real harm, but to create a level of controlled chaos that would highlight the absurdity of trying to impose suburban rules on a working farm. The first escape involved Bessie, Bart's prize-winning Holstein cow. Bessie was a gentle giant, but she also had a knack for finding weak spots in fences. With a little encouragement from Bart, a strategically placed bucket of extra sweet feed just outside a slightly loosened section of the electric fence, Bessie ambled her way onto the pristine lawns of Oakhaven Meadows. The resulting scene was pure pandemonium. Bessie, delighted by the abundance of lush, green grass, proceeded to graze her way through Mrs. Periwinkle's prize-winning rose bushes, leaving a trail of cow patties and trampled flowers in her wake. She then wandered onto the community golf course, where she interrupted a tense putting competition by taking a leisurely stroll across the green, leaving hoof prints in the meticulously manicured turf. The Oakhaven Meadows online forum exploded. Residents posted frantic messages about a rogue cow, terrorizing the community. Deborah Sterling, already at her wits' end, issued an emergency alert, and called for Bart's immediate arrest. The local police, however, were more amused than alarmed. Sergeant Miller, a seasoned officer who knew Bart and understood the situation, responded with a chuckle and a promise to round up the culprit. Bessie was eventually returned to the farm, escorted by Sergeant Miller and a sheepish-looking Bart, who feigned ignorance about how she'd gotten out. He blamed faulty wiring in the electric fence, a claim that Deborah Sterling vehemently disputed, but couldn't immediately disprove. The next escape involved a flock of Bart's chickens. This time the accident, occurred during the Oakhaven Meadows annual garden party, a highly anticipated social event held on the community's central green. With a well-timed flick of a switch that momentarily deactivated a section of the fence, and a strategically scattered handful of chicken feed, Bart unleashed a feathered frenzy upon the unsuspecting partygoers. Chickens were everywhere, perched on picnic tables, pecking at canapes, and flapping around the heads of horrified residents. The scene, captured on numerous smartphones and quickly uploaded to social media, was one of utter chaos. Deborah Sterling, in her elegant summer dress and wide-brimmed hat, was seen shrieking and swatting at the chickens with a rolled-up newspaper. The garden party, meant to be a showcase of Oakhaven Meadows' refined lifestyle, descended into a barnyard brawl. The escapes continued for several weeks, each one more elaborate and disruptive than the last. A group of goats invaded the community swimming pool, leaving a trail of, goat droppings, in their wake. A particularly stubborn pig named Wilbur took up residence in the Oakhaven Meadows community garden, rooting up vegetables and generally wreaking havoc. The local news media, initially amused by the story, started to cover it more seriously. Jessica Miller, the reporter from the Oakhaven Gazette, wrote a follow-up article highlighting the escalating tensions between Bart and the HOA. She interviewed several residents, some of whom were still outraged, but others who were starting to see the humor in the situation, and even a few who were openly questioning the HOA's leadership. Jed Hawkins, Bart's lawyer, continued to defend him against the HOA's legal threats. He argued that the escapes were accidental, and that Bart was doing everything he could to contain his livestock. He also subtly hinted at the possibility of a countersuit, claiming that the HOA's actions were causing Bart undue stress and financial hardship. The controlled chaos was having the desired effect. The Oakhaven Meadows HOA, once united in its opposition to Bart, was now fractured and divided. Residents were arguing amongst themselves, blaming each other for the escalating situation. Deborah Sterling's authority was being challenged, and her calls for stricter enforcement were met with increasing resistance. The focus had shifted. It was no longer just about the electric fence. It was about the fundamental incompatibility of a working farm and a meticulously manicured suburban community. Bart, watching the chaos unfold from his farmhouse window, allowed himself a small, weary smile. He was winning, but he knew the war wasn't over yet. He was ready. The Great Livestock Escapes, as the local media had dubbed them, had pushed Oakhaven Meadows to the brink of a full-blown civil war. Deborah Sterling, facing mounting pressure from residents and the threat of a recall election, finally agreed to meet with Bart Higgins and Jed Hawkins for a mediated negotiation. The atmosphere in the neutral conference room, chosen specifically for not being in the Oakhaven HOA office, was thick with tension. Deborah, looking haggard and defeated, arrived with Mr. Abernathy, who seemed equally subdued. Bart, accompanied by Jed, sat opposite them, his expression unreadable. The mediator, a retired judge named Patricia Thompson, known for her no-nonsense approach and her ability to find common ground in even the most intractable disputes, laid out the ground rules. The negotiations were long and arduous. Deborah initially insisted on the complete removal of the electric fence and strict adherence to all HOA bylaws. Bart, backed by Jed's legal arguments, refused to budge on the fence, arguing that it was necessary to protect his property and his livelihood. He reiterated that his farm had existed long before Oakhaven Meadows, and he had a right to continue operating it as he saw fit. Judge Thompson, however, skillfully steered the conversation towards finding a compromise. She pointed out that neither side was going to get everything they wanted, and that continued conflict would only lead to more expense, more stress, and more livestock-related incidents. She proposed a series of concessions from both sides. After hours of intense debate, a compromise was reached. The agreement, painstakingly drafted by Jed and Abernathy, was a complex document, but its key points were as follows. The electric fence. The electric fence would remain, but Bart agreed to lower the voltage to a level deemed safe for humans and pets, while still being effective for livestock. He also agreed to install additional warning signs and to regularly inspect the fence to ensure it was in good working order. Livestock management. Bart agreed to implement a more robust livestock management plan, including reinforced fencing in areas deemed high risk for escapes. He also agreed to limit the number of certain types of livestock, particularly the more disruptive ones, Wilbur the pig for instance, would be relocated to a more secluded part of the farm. Aesthetic considerations. Bart agreed to make some minor aesthetic improvements to his property, such as planting a row of trees along the road to partially screen the farm from view. He also agreed to keep his farm equipment reasonably tidy and out of sight when not in use. The community land bylaw. This was the biggest victory for Bart. The HOA agreed to amend Bylaw 47B, specifically the section pertaining to community land, to exempt existing agricultural operations. This effectively grandfathered Higgins' harvest, protecting it from future attempts to impose suburban regulations on his farm. Communication and cooperation. Both parties agreed to establish a regular communication channel, a liaison committee, composed of representatives from the farm and the HOA, to address any future concerns or disputes in a more constructive manner. The agreement was signed, sealed, and delivered. Deborah Sterling, though clearly unhappy with the outcome, recognized that it was the best she could hope for under the circumstances. She had lost the war, but she had managed to salvage some semblance of order and control. Bart Higgins, while not entirely thrilled with the concessions he had made, was satisfied with the overall result. He had protected his farm, his livelihood, and his heritage. He had stood up to the HOA and won. In the weeks and months that followed, a fragile peace settled over Oakhaven Meadows and Higgins' harvest. The liaison committee met regularly, and while there were still occasional disagreements, they were resolved through dialogue and compromise, not through lawsuits and livestock escapes. Mrs. Henderson and her poodle, Fifi, still walked past the farm, but they gave the electric fence a wide berth. The Oakhaven Meadows online forum was still active, but the tone had shifted from outrage to grudging acceptance, and even occasional amusement. Jessica Miller, the reporter from the Oakhaven Gazette, wrote a final article on the story, hailing it as a victory for compromise and common sense. She praised Bart Higgins for his tenacity and Judge Thompson for her wisdom. She even suggested that the story could serve as a valuable lesson for other communities grappling with similar conflicts between rural traditions and suburban development. Bart, standing on his porch looking out over his fields, felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in months. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over his cows grazing peacefully in the pasture. He knew that the future wouldn't be without its challenges, but he also knew that he could handle them. He had fought for his land and he had won. He had proven that even a stubborn old farmer, with a little help from his livestock and a good lawyer, could stand up to the powers that be and prevail. The scent of manure, mixed with the faint hum of the electric fence, was to him the sweet smell of victory. He could rest now. And he could do it knowing that no one was going to change his livelihood. If you enjoyed this wild ride of farm feuds and electric fences, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss our next story.